Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into the 2000 U.S. presidential election. You know, the one Bush versus Gore, super close, came down to Florida, and eventually a Supreme Court decision.
Yeah, Gore won the popular vote, but Bush got the Electoral College. An absolute nail-biter.
Exactly. So our big question for this deep dive is, did campaign finance, the money side of things, actually play a decisive role in that razor-thin finish?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? Especially when the margin was so incredibly small.
We've looked at election funding analysis, news reports from back then, academic takes, basically trying to follow the money and see if it really tipped the scales.
And we'll be exploring a few key themes. Things like the public funding system in the general election, what its limits were.
And Bush's big fundraising advantage early on, right?
Right. Plus the surge in what they called soft money, that less regulated cash. And of course, the whole debate about whether spending actually translates into votes.
Okay, so the goal is to get a clearer picture of how money flowed and, well, whether it really mattered in the end.
Let's try. We want listeners to really grasp these financial dynamics and their potential impact.
All right, let's jump in. General election funding first.
Yeah.
Both Bush and Gore took public money, about $68 million each.
That's correct, around $68 million. And accepting that money meant their official campaigns agreed not to raise or spend any additional private funds for the general election campaign itself.
Okay, so why did they have this system? What was the thinking behind it?
Well, the main idea, going back to post-Watergate reforms, really, was to try and level the playing field a bit. And importantly, to reduce the reliance on big private donations. Lessen the chance of candidates feeling beholden to major donors if they won.
Avoid potential quid pro quo situations down the line. Makes sense.
Exactly. And another piece of it, accepting those funds, also meant they had to file their financial disclosures electronically with the FEC.
So it increased transparency too.
Definitely. You could see more clearly, at least for the official campaigns, where the money was coming from and going. It gives us a good record now for this kind of analysis.
So for the candidates' direct campaigns, it sounds like a fairly level playing field financially during the general election period.
In theory, yes. For their official campaigns, the spending limits were the same.
But I sense a but coming. That wasn't the whole story, was it?
Not even close. Because while the candidates themselves were capped, the political parties, national and state, and also independent groups, they faced far fewer restrictions.
Okay, so the money action kind of shifted.
Precisely. A lot of the private fundraising, and especially the spending, moved over to these other entities. They were the ones raising and spending huge amounts of that soft money.
Right, soft money. Let's linger on that for a second. But first, how did the candidates actually spend their $68 million? Sources say a lot went to TV ads.
A huge chunk, yeah. Both campaigns poured money into television. We're talking combined around $67 million just from the candidates' public funds on TV ads.
Were their strategies similar in how they spent that ad money?
Well, there were some really interesting differences. Take Bush, for example. He spent a lot in California.
California, how much?
Something like $10.8 million on TV ads there.
Wow. But California wasn't really considered a swing state then, was it? Gore won it pretty comfortably.
Exactly. Bush lost California by a significant margin. So spending nearly $11 million there, well, it didn't translate into electoral votes.
So a big spend with maybe not much return in terms of the final outcome?
It really highlights that just throwing money at a state doesn't guarantee success, especially if it's not really in play. Strategic allocation is key.
What about Gore's strategy with his ad money?
His approach was different. Our sources show he spent basically no TV ad money in California.
Okay. So where did he focus?
He concentrated his resources much more on the classic battleground states, places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Washington.
And those were states he ended up winning, right?
He did, all of them. It suggests a more targeted approach, focusing those limited public funds where they might make the most difference.
So even though their direct spending totals were almost identical where they spent, it seems quite different.
Very different. And potentially quite revealing about their campaign strategies and how they saw the electoral map.
Okay, so the direct candidate spending is sort of a wash in terms of totals, but with interesting strategic differences. Now let's get back to that soft money. You said that's where the real action was.
Oh, absolutely. The 2000 election cycle is often seen as the peak, or maybe the Wild West, of soft money.
Define soft money for us again, quickly.
Sure. It was basically money donated to political parties, not directly to candidates. And crucially, it wasn't subject to the same contribution limits or source restrictions as hard money, which is the money candidates raise directly.
So corporations, unions, wealthy individuals could give huge amounts.
Exactly, unlimited amounts. The official justification was that this money was for party-building activities, things like voter registration, get-out-the-vote efforts, generic party promotion.
Well, it wasn't always used just for that, was it?
Well, that's the thing. By 2000, a massive loophole had developed. Parties were increasingly using this soft money to fund what they called issue advocacy ads.
Issue ads. Meaning?
Ads that would discuss a candidate's stance on, say, Social Security or education, often criticizing them, but without explicitly saying vote for or vote against them.
Ah, the magic words test. So they could attack a candidate without technically advocating for their defeat.
Precisely. And functionally, these ads often looked and sounded exactly like campaign ads. It became a huge way to pump money into influencing the election outside the regulated system.
And the scale of this in 2000 was enormous.
It's staggering. State party committees alone raised something like $570 million.
Wow.
And nearly half of that, about $263 million, was soft money transferred from the national parties.
And where did that money go?
It was heavily targeted at the key swing states. Florida, Michigan, Pennsylvania got the lion's share.
Any difference between the parties and where they got the soft money from?
Yeah, there were patterns. Republican parties tended to get more from business interests, corporations, the financial sector, real estate. Democrats tended to rely more on labor unions, lawyers, public sector unions.
And this money directly fueled those issue ads we were talking about.
Absolutely. It led to a situation, really for the first time, where the national parties actually spend more on presidential TV ads than the presidential candidates themselves did.
Really? More than the candidates' $67 million.
Yeah. The RNC and DNC combined spent almost $80 million on TV ads, all funded by that soft money, completely outside the candidate's spending limit.
And Florida got a big chunk of that party money, too.
Florida was ground zero. The state parties there received about $27 million in national soft money transfers, which paid for a huge volume of advertising.
So the candidates are level pegging with public funds, but their parties are in this massive unregulated spending war using soft money.
That's a very good way to put it. A parallel financial war fought with different rules.
Were there other players besides the parties? Independent groups?
Yes, there were independent groups too, spending money often on issue ads or sometimes direct advocacy. But interestingly, the dynamic was different there. Groups supporting Gore actually spent significantly more on TV ads than groups supporting Bush. We're talking maybe $14 million for pro-Gore ads versus only about $2 million for pro-Bush ads from these outside groups.
14 versus 2. That's a big difference. Why?
Well, groups like Planned Parenthood were major spenders supporting Gore, making up a noticeable chunk, maybe 18% of his total ad support. On the Republican side, it seems many of the big independent groups were actually focusing their money more on congressional races, particularly trying to hold the House.
So Gore got more help from independent groups, at least on TV.
Considerably more, yes. Less than 3% of Bush's TV ad support came from those kinds of groups.
Okay, let's try and put it all together then. Candidate spending, party soft money spending, independent group spending. Who spent more overall in the general election?
If you tally up all the ad spending nationwide supporting each candidate, Bush comes out slightly ahead. About $86 million supporting Bush versus around $77 million supporting Gore.
So Bush did have an edge overall in ad spending.
A slight edge nationwide, yes. But, and this is a big but, remember that $10.8 million Bush spent in California.
The state he lost badly.
Yeah. If you take that California spending out of the equation, because arguably it didn't impact the swing states, then Gore's total ad support was actually slightly higher than Bush's in the rest of the country.
Ah, okay, so that strategic allocation really clouds the simple who spent more picture.
It really does. It brings it back to where the money was spent. In Florida, for instance, the Bush campaign plus the Republican Party generally outspent Gore and the Democrats in certain key markets, like the more conservative areas and Miami.
But not everywhere in Florida.
No, it was more balanced in places like Tampa and Orlando, which are often seen as bellwether regions. And interestingly, Bush forces tended to outspend Gore in states Bush won, like West Virginia or New Hampshire. Conversely, Gore tended to outspend Bush in the battlegrounds he won, like Michigan and Pennsylvania.
So it sounds like the real financial battle wasn't between the candidates directly, but in this murky world of party soft money and its strategic deployment in swing states.
That's absolutely the takeaway for the general election period. The publicly funded candidate campaigns were almost a sideshow financially compared to the party spending war.
Okay, that clarifies the general election dynamics. But you mentioned earlier that Bush had a big overall advantage if you look at the entire election cycle, including the primaries.
Yes, that's crucial. When you zoom out and look at the whole 2000 cycle, primaries included, the numbers are quite different. Bush's total spending was around $172 million.
Okay. And Gore.
Gore spent about $127 million total.
So Bush outspent Gore by, what, $45 million overall? That's a significant gap.
A very significant gap. And the main reason for it goes back to their decisions about primary funding.
Right. Bush opted out of public funding for the primaries.
Exactly. Gore accepted federal matching funds during the primaries, which meant he had to abide by state-by-state spending limits and an overall primary spending cap.
But Bush, by opting out, could raise and spend basically unlimited private money as long as individual donations stayed within the legal limit.
Correct. And he made that decision very early. By mid-1999, he'd already decided to forego about $16.5 million in potential matching funds, specifically so he wouldn't be constrained by those spending limits.
And he raised a ton of money early on.
A massive amount. He pulled in over $36 million very quickly after setting up his exploratory committee. That huge early war chest probably did a lot to establish him as the frontrunner and perhaps even deter some potential rivals from mounting a serious challenge.
It's hard to run against someone with that kind of financial head start.
Extremely difficult. It sends a strong signal of viability and strength.
Did the sources of their funding differ much, besides Bush just raising more?
Yes, there was a difference in the composition. Bush relied much more heavily on larger individual contributions. Donations of $1,000, which was the maximum individual contribution limit then, made up something like 63% of Bush's individual donations. While he did try to cultivate small donors, the big checks were the foundation.
And Gore?
His proportion from $1,000 donors was lower. He relied a bit more on smaller contributions comparatively, though both obviously sought large donations too.
What about industries? Did they lean one way or the other?
Definitely. Industry contributions heavily favored Bush, especially from sectors like finance, insurance, real estate, construction, energy, and health sectors. Gore received significant support from lawyers and lobbyists, and unions were a major factor for the Democrats generally.
Okay, so stepping back, Bush had a major overall spending advantage across the entire cycle, built mainly during the primaries by opting out of public funds and leveraging large donations. Gore was outspent overall, despite the level playing field in the general election funding for the candidates themselves.
That summarizes the overall financial picture quite well.
Now, for the million-dollar question, or maybe the $172 million question, did this financial advantage win the election for Bush?
The causal link. That's always the toughest part in campaign finance analysis, isn't it?
It seems like it. What does the evidence suggest?
Well, on the surface, you see the higher overall spender, Bush, won the Electoral College. That fits a general pattern we often see, especially in congressional races. Money often correlates with winning. But Gore won the popular vote by over 500,000 votes. So the person who was outspent actually got more individual votes nationwide. That immediately complicates things.
And the election came down to Florida by just over 500 votes after all the recounts and court battles?
Exactly. When it's that close, can you really isolate the effect of money from everything else?
Like what other factors?
Well, we talked about the state-level spending. Bush's California spend was ineffective. In Florida, yes, he had a spending advantage in some key markets, which might have helped mobilize just enough voters or persuade a few undecideds in that incredibly tight race. But it's hard to prove definitively.
And Gore outspent Bush in some battlegrounds he won.
Right. The correlation isn't perfect. Plus, you have huge confounding factors.
Such as?
Third-party candidates. Ralph Nader, running for the Green Party, got nearly 100,000 votes in Florida. Most analysts believe the vast majority of those votes would have otherwise gone to Gore.
Enough to potentially swing the state, given the margin.
Absolutely. So how much does spending matter compared to the Nader effect? It's incredibly difficult to untangle.
What do academics say about money's impact generally?
It's honestly divided. Some studies find significant effects of spending, especially on name recognition for challengers or in mobilizing base supporters through advertising and field operations. Others argue the impact is often marginal, especially in high-profile presidential races where voters already have strong opinions and get tons of free media coverage.
The free media factor is huge in presidential races.
It is, and distinguishing correlation, does money flow to likely winners, from causation, does money make winners, is the fundamental challenge. Money often chases viability.
And there were so many other things going on in 2000 beyond money and Nader.
Oh, definitely. You had major policy debates, what to do with the budget surplus, education reform, Social Security lockboxes.
Senator perceptions too, right?
Yeah.
Gore trying to step out of Clinton's shadow, Bush pushing compassionate conservatism.
Yes, the personalities, the debates, the underlying tension between focusing on the good economy versus social and cultural values. And ultimately, the defining factor became the Florida recount itself and the unprecedented Supreme Court intervention in Bush v. Gore.
That seemed to overshadow everything else in the end.
It really did. But the Electoral College system itself is key here, too, because it concentrates everything on a few swing states. Even a small advantage, whether from spending or organization or candidate appeal in a state like Florida, can be magnified into having a decisive impact on the national outcome when the race is that close.
So a marginal spending edge in one or two Florida media markets could have theoretically made the difference, even if we can't definitively prove it.
It's certainly plausible. In an election decided by a few hundred votes, everything is potentially decisive. But pinning it solely or even primarily on the spending difference is probably too simplistic.
Okay, so bringing this all together as we wrap up our deep dive, what are the main financial takeaways from the 2000 election experience?
Well, I think first, money clearly played a significant role, but it wasn't a simple case of the biggest spender automatically winning everything. It's much more complex.
We saw that level playing field, financially speaking, for the candidates in the general election thanks to public funding.
Right. But that was counteracted by Bush's huge overall spending advantage built during the primaries.
And the absolute explosion of soft money funneled through the political parties, which became the main financial battleground in the general election.
Definitely. The strategic allocation of those funds, especially party soft money, into swing states was critical. And finally, there's the ongoing debate about how much all that spending actually influenced the final, incredibly close outcome.
So if a listener asks, did Bush and Gore have equal funding?
For their official campaigns in the general election, basically yes, due to public funds.
Did Bush outspend Gore overall?
Yes, significantly, across the whole cycle, mostly due to the primaries.
And who spent more in Florida?
Generally, Bush and the Republicans had a spending edge in key Florida markets, but it wasn't uniform across the state.
It really feels like 2000 was a watershed moment for campaign finance. It highlighted the loopholes, the power of party money.
It absolutely did. And the sheer prominence of soft money in that election was a direct catalyst for the bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, McCain-Feingold, which passed in 2002.
Which aimed to ban that national party soft money.
Exactly. Though, as we know, subsequent court rulings, like Citizens United, have reshaped the landscape again, leading to super PACs and other forms of outside spending. The debate over money in politics definitely didn't end in 2000.
It seems like the 2000 funding story is a perfect example of needing to understand the money flow for context, but realizing it's just one thread in a much bigger tapestry.
Well said. The public funding created this temporary parity for candidates, but the unregulated party spending really showed where the energy and, well, the money were going.
And the focus on swing states like Florida just hammers home how much the Electoral College dictates strategy. Not just campaign stops, but where the dollars flow.
Every decision is filtered through that lens. Where can we spend money to get the most electoral bang for her buck?
And with Florida decided by, 537 votes officially, you can't help but wonder if a few extra dollars spent on ads in Palm Beach County or on Get Out the Vote in Orlando, could it have flipped just enough votes?
It's the tantalizing question, isn't it? But again, we have to weigh that against Nader, against the butterfly ballots, against the court decisions.
So many factors. What stands out to you personally as the most surprising or perhaps counterintuitive thing about the 2000 money story?
For me, it might be that stark contrast. The highest overall spender wins the presidency, but the popular vote winner was actually outspent. It really challenges any simple narrative about money directly buying elections.
Yeah.
It forces you to look deeper at how and where money is spent and what else is going on.
Yeah, it's definitely not a straightforward correlation.
Not at all.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. For listeners wanting to explore more, you mentioned the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, looking into its effects, and maybe the subsequent court cases would be a great next step.
Or even just looking at spending data from more recent presidential elections to see how things like super PACs have changed the game since 2000.
Absolutely. The landscape keeps evolving, and the debate about money's role in our democracy is clearly ongoing. Thanks for walking us through this.
My pleasure. It's a critical piece of election history to understand.